She kissed a stranger to make her ex jealous. Unaware. He was her new billionaire boss. The crystalline chandeliers of the Mercury Lounge cast dancing shadows across marble floors. But Rebecca Torres couldn't appreciate the elegance tonight. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the smooth piano melody drifting through the upscale Manhattan bar. The text from her coworker Maya still glowed accusingly on her phone screen. "Don't come. He brought someone. Please, Becca, just go home." But she hadn't gone home. She'd walked through those heavy brass doors anyway, driven by a sick need to see the truth with her own eyes. And now she had. Tucked into a secluded leather booth near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Fifth Avenue sat her boyfriend of 4 years, Daniel Ashford, his arm draped possessively around a woman Rebecca recognized from his investment firm. The redhead he'd always insisted was merely a professional contact. Their body language told a different story entirely. His fingers traced lazy circles on her shoulder. Her hand rested high on his thigh. They weren't discussing quarterly reports. The pain hit Rebecca like a physical force, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her vision blur at the edges. For several excruciating seconds, she stood frozen in the doorway, a sculpture of devastation carved from shattered trust and broken promises. Then something shifted inside her. The anguish crystallized into something harder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. She moved toward them with measured steps, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor with the cadence of an executioner's march. "Daniel," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with unexpected steadiness. He glanced up, and she watched his expression cycle through surprise, guilt, and finally settling on irritation. Not remorse. Irritation. As if she were an inconvenient interruption to his evening. "Rebecca. What are you doing here?" His tone carried accusation rather than shame, as though she were the one who'd done something wrong by discovering his betrayal. "I could ask you the same question," she replied, her gaze shifting deliberately to the redheady, who now looked like she wanted to disappear into the expensive upholstery, though I think the answer is fairly obvious. Daniel sighed with theatrical exasperation, running his hand through his perfectly styled hair in a gesture she'd once found endearing and now found revolting. "Look, Rebecca, let's be adults about this. There's no need to cause a scene in public." "A scene?" The word came out as a bitter laugh. "You're sitting here with another woman, in a bar where half of our social circle comes to drink, and you're concerned about me causing a scene." He stood then, his 6-foot frame straightening as his features hardened into something cruel and unfamiliar. Or perhaps it had always been there, and she'd simply chosen not to see it. "You want honesty?" His voice dropped low, meant to be private, but carrying just enough for nearby patrons to hear. "Fine. You're safe, Rebecca. You're reliable. But safe and reliable gets boring after a while. A man needs excitement, needs someone who challenges him intellectually and physically." He gestured toward the redhead with casual dismissiveness. "Victoria here understands ambition. She understands what it takes to succeed in my world. You've always been content to play it small." The public humiliation was a knife between her ribs, twisting with every word. He hadn't just ended their relationship. He'd eviscerated her character, reduced her worth to nothing, made her feel like a placeholder he'd outgrown. Hot tears of rage and mortification burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of him and his conquest and the curious onlookers now pretending not to stare. Her eyes swept the room desperately, seeking escape or vengeance or anything that might salvage what remained of her dignity. Then she saw him. Sitting alone at the far end of the sleek marble bar was a man who seemed to exist in a different category of human altogether. Tall, with dark hair that looked artfully disheveled, he wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. But it wasn't the expensive tailoring that made him magnetic. It was the way he occupied space, the stillness that radiated power more effectively than any aggressive posturing ever could. His strong jawline and intense dark eyes gave him an almost predatory quality, like a panther surveying its territory from the shadows. He was, without question, the most dangerous-looking man in the room. Perfect. Fueled by a cocktail of heartbreak, humiliation, and reckless fury, Rebecca made a decision that would alter the entire trajectory of her life. She turned her back on Daniel mid-sentence, cutting off whatever additional cruelty he'd been preparing to deliver. She walked straight toward the stranger with purpose in every step, her body moving on pure instinct before her rational mind could intervene and stop this insanity. The man looked up as she approached, one dark eyebrow rising slightly in surprise. His eyes were the color of espresso, unreadable and assessing. She didn't give him time to speak or question or refuse. She reached out, grabbed the silk lapel of his ridiculously expensive suit, pulled him toward her with surprising force, and kissed him. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was a kiss born of 4 years of devotion being thrown back in her face. It was fury and heartbreak and defiance all compressed into a single moment of contact. For a heartbeat, the stranger went completely still, clearly shocked by her audacity. Then something shifted. His hand came up to the small of her back, firm and possessing, pulling her closer against him. His lips moved against hers with controlled intensity, as though he'd decided to play along with whatever game she'd started. The kiss deepened, and Rebecca felt an unexpected jolt of electricity run through her body. Something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with the man whose mouth was now claiming hers. When she finally broke away, breathless and slightly dizzy, she didn't look at the stranger. She turned her gaze directly to Daniel, whose face had gone from smug satisfaction to complete shock. His mouth hung open inelegantly, and Victoria looked equally stunned beside him. "You know what, Daniel?" Rebecca's voice rang out clear and strong, carrying through the suddenly quiet section of the bar. "I think you're right. I was playing it too safe, but not anymore. Turns out I was just waiting for something worth taking a risk for." With her head held high and her heart hammering against her ribs, Rebecca turned on her heel and walked out of the Mercury Lounge. She left behind her cheating ex-boyfriend, a room full of gossip-hungry witnesses, and one very intrigued, very powerful stranger whose name she didn't even know. The cool October air hit her face as she stepped onto Fifth Avenue, and only then did she allow herself to process what she'd just done. She'd kissed a complete stranger, a gorgeous, intimidating, obviously wealthy, complete stranger. It had been impulsive and possibly insane, but God, it had felt incredible. Monday morning at Catalyst Creative Agency arrived with the inevitability of a train wreck. Rebecca threw herself into her work with desperate intensity, using complex marketing campaigns and brand strategy presentations as armor against the emotional aftermath of the weekend. She'd successfully ignored Daniel's barrage of furious text messages and voicemails, each one more aggressive than the last. But she couldn't ignore the memory of her own reckless behavior, the feeling of that stranger's mouth on hers, the way he'd pulled her closer instead of pushing her away. The memory made her flush with embarrassment every time it surfaced, which was approximately every 10 minutes. Around 9:30, an unusual tension began rippling through the open-plan office. People clustered around computer screens, speaking in urgent whispers. Rebecca's desk neighbor, a graphic designer named Tyler, rolled his chair over with wide eyes. "Becca, have you checked your email? The one marked urgent?" His voice carried a note of barely contained panic. She pulled up her inbox and felt her stomach drop. Subject line, mandatory company-wide meeting, 10 a.m. All employees required to attend without exception. The body of the email was brief and devastating. Catalyst Creative Agency had been acquired by Wolf Media Group, effective immediately. They were now a subsidiary of one of the largest media conglomerates in North America. A town hall meeting would introduce their new leadership structure and explain the transition. The conference room was packed beyond capacity, bodies pressed together in nervous proximity. Rebecca found herself wedged between Tyler and their department head, Janet, both looking equally anxious. The air felt thick with fear and speculation about layoffs, restructuring, the corporate speak that usually meant people's lives were about to be turned upside down. "I heard Wolf Media Group is ruthless," Tyler muttered under his breath. "They buy companies and strip them for parts. Fire half the staff within the first month." "I heard their CEO is some kind of corporate tyrant," Janet added in a whisper. "Built his empire on hostile takeovers and zero-tolerance policies. This is going to be a bloodbath." Rebecca's hands twisted together in her lap, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. She'd worked at Catalyst for 6 years, worked her way up from junior copywriter to senior brand strategist. This company, these people, this work, it was the one stable thing in her life right now. And it was all about to change. At precisely 10 o'clock, their director of operations, a nervous man named Paul Henderson, walked to the front of the room. His hands visibly shook as he gripped the podium. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "As you know, we're entering a new chapter for Catalyst Creative. It is my honor to introduce the visionary leader who will be guiding us forward. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and CEO of Wolf Media Group, Mr. Jonathan Wolf." A man walked through the side entrance, and Rebecca's entire world tilted violently off its axis. It was him, the stranger from the bar, the man she'd kissed with reckless abandon in front of half of Manhattan's social elite. He looked even more formidable now, standing at the front of the room in another perfectly tailored suit, this one navy blue that made his dark eyes look almost black. His presence commanded absolute attention, silencing the whispered conversations and nervous shuffling. Those same dark eyes that had looked at her with surprise and then heated interest now swept across the assembled employees with cool, analytical precision. Then they found her. His gaze locked onto hers across the crowded room, and she watched his expression shift almost imperceptibly. A flicker of recognition, a flash of something that might have been surprise or amusement or both. His mouth, the mouth she'd kissed with desperate passion, curved into the barest hint of a smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a chess master who'd just realized his opponent had inadvertently put herself in check. Rebecca's heart, which had momentarily stopped beating entirely, now began slamming against her ribs so violently she was certain everyone around her could hear it. The blood drained from her face, leaving her dizzy and nauseous. This couldn't be happening. This was the universe's cruelest joke, cosmic karma coming back to destroy her for that one moment of impulsive insanity. Jonathan Wolf delivered a speech about synergy, innovation, and the future of integrated media solutions. It was a standard corporate address, carefully crafted and professionally delivered. But to Rebecca, every word felt loaded with subtext. Every pause seemed deliberate. Every time his eyes drifted back to her location in the crowd, felt like a threat wrapped in expensive Italian wool. When the speech concluded, the room erupted in polite, uncertain applause. As employees began to disperse, murmuring anxiously about the changes ahead, Jonathan Wolf descended from the small stage. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who owned not just this company, but possibly the entire building, the block, perhaps the city itself. People instinctively moved aside to let him pass, creating a clear path through the mass of bodies. Rebecca tried to make herself smaller, to blend into the background and escape before he reached her, but his trajectory was unmistakable. He stopped directly in front of her, and her colleagues immediately took several steps back, leaving her isolated and exposed before him like a sacrifice offered to an angry god. "Miss Torres, correct." His voice was smooth and controlled, carrying authority that made the hair on her arms stand up. But his eyes, those dark, intense eyes, held a glint of something far more complex than simple professional interest. "I was reviewing personnel files this morning. Your work in brand strategy has been consistently impressive. Very creative approach to problem solving." He extended his hand, and it wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a command, a test, a reminder of who held the power in this interaction. Numbly, her hand trembling slightly, Rebecca placed it in his. His grip was firm and warm, his skin sending an unwelcome jolt of sensory memory through her system. The memory of his hand on her back, pulling her closer, responding to her desperate kiss with surprising heat. "I'd like to see you in my new office," he continued, his voice dropping just low enough that only she could hear him clearly. 15 minutes. We have several things to discuss regarding your future with this organization. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. And they both knew there was absolutely no way she could refuse without raising suspicion or potentially losing her job on her first day under new management. He released her hand and continued walking, leaving her standing there with her pulse racing and her mind spinning through every possible terrible outcome this conversation might produce. The 15-minute walk through the office to the executive floor felt like a death march. Rebecca's legs shook beneath her pencil skirt, and her palms were clammy despite the office's aggressive air conditioning. She'd never been to the top floor before. It had always been reserved for the founder and the executive team, a space that regular employees like her never accessed. The elevator ride up felt interminable, each floor ding marking another second closer to her professional execution. The executive suite had been completely transformed. What had once been a warmly decorated, slightly cluttered space filled with inspirational posters and family photos was now a minimalist fortress of glass, steel, and intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan's skyline. A massive desk made of dark wood and metal dominated the space, and behind it, Jonathan Wolfe stood with his back to the door, looking out at his newly acquired kingdom. Rebecca knocked softly on the glass door, the sound barely audible even in the silent hallway. "Come in," he commanded without turning around. She entered, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded final, like a prison cell locking. "Take a seat, Miss Torres." He still didn't turn around, his attention seemingly fixed on the cityscape beyond the windows. She sat in one of the sleek chairs facing his desk, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. The silence stretched out, oppressive and deliberate, a power play designed to make her even more uncomfortable than she already was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jonathan turned around. He leaned casually against the window frame, his arms crossed over his chest, and studied her with an expression that managed to be both amused and completely unreadable. "Well," he began, his voice carrying that same smooth, dangerous quality from the bar. That was certainly the most memorable introduction I've ever received from an employee. "Quite the performance, Miss Torres. The passion, the timing, the sheer audacity of it all. I have to admit, I'm impressed." Rebecca's face burned with humiliation. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the expensive chair and cease to exist entirely. "Mr. Wolfe, I am so sorry. I had absolutely no idea who you were. It was a mistake. A terrible lapse in judgment, completely unprofessional." "A mistake?" he interrupted, pushing off from the window and beginning to circle around her chair slowly, like a predator assessing prey. "I don't think it was a mistake at all. It was calculated, emotionally driven, yes, but calculated nonetheless. You wanted to hurt someone who had hurt you, and you succeeded spectacularly. I respect that kind of strategic thinking, even if the execution was somewhat unconventional." He completed his circle and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne again, something expensive and woodsy that brought back the tactile memory of that kiss with unfortunate clarity. The problem, Rebecca," he said, using her first name deliberately, intimately, in a way that felt both threatening and strangely thrilling, "is that your talent and your impulsiveness are now assets of my company, and I cannot have my assets behaving unpredictably. It creates complications." Rebecca braced herself for the inevitable termination, her mind already calculating how long her savings would last while she searched for a new position. "I understand. I'll clear out my desk immediately." Jonathan let out a short, humorless laugh that sent shivers down her spine. "Fire you? No, that would be far too simple, and I'm not a simple man, Miss Torres. Firing you would mean I don't get to fully explore the delightful irony of this situation. And I do appreciate irony. He moved behind his desk, sitting down in his leather chair with fluid grace, his eyes never leaving her face. No, you're not fired. But your current position in the marketing department no longer exists as of this moment. Panic flooded through her system, cold and overwhelming. Oh, what do you mean? Effective immediately, you are my executive liaison for strategic development, he announced, the title sounding simultaneously like a promotion and a prison sentence. You will report exclusively and directly to me. You will work on all priority projects that require creative oversight. Your desk will be relocated to the outer office adjacent to this suite. You will be available when I need you, which will be frequently. Rebecca stared at him, understanding slowly dawning like a terrible sunrise. He'd isolated her completely, removed her from her team, her colleagues, her support system, placed her directly under his authority in a position where she would have to see him, interact with him, answer to him every single day, where every other employee would see her constant proximity to the CEO and draw their own conclusions about how she'd earned such sudden elevation. Consider this an opportunity, Rebecca, he continued, that predatory smile returning to his features. An opportunity to prove that your passion and creativity aren't limited to dramatic displays in upscale bars. You wanted to make a statement, to show that you're not safe and predictable. Well, congratulations! Your life is about to become very interesting indeed. She sat there, frozen in her chair, fully comprehending the extent of her nightmare. She hadn't just kissed a stranger in a moment of revenge-fueled madness. She'd kissed her new boss, her new tormentor, the man who now controlled her professional future and apparently intended to make her pay for her impulsiveness in the most prolonged, excruciating way possible. That one reckless kiss had just transformed into an indefinite sentence, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it except endure whatever game he'd decided to play. If you're still watching, you absolutely need to hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next between Rebecca and Jonathan is going to blow your mind. This is just the beginning of their twisted game, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of what's coming. Subscribe now, and let's continue this wild ride together. The next morning, Rebecca's entire professional world had been dismantled and reconstructed overnight. Her familiar desk in the bustling creative department, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of designers and copywriters brainstorming and collaborating, was gone. In its place was a sleek workspace in the silent, sterile executive anteroom directly outside Jonathan's office. It was a beautiful prison, all glass and chrome and isolation. Her former colleagues would walk past on their way to meetings, offering sympathetic smiles or deliberately avoiding eye contact, clearly uncertain how to interact with her now that she'd been elevated to this strange new position. She was no longer one of them. She was now the CEO's executive liaison, a title that dripped with implication and spawned immediate gossip. The whispers started almost before she'd finished setting up her new computer. Jonathan wasted no time establishing the parameters of her new role. Before noon on her first day in this position, he summoned her into his office with a simple intercom command that made her feel like a secretary from a 1950s film. Your first major project, he announced without preamble, gesturing to a chair across from his desk, is to lead the complete rebranding initiative for Wolf Media Group itself. Rebecca's blood turned to ice in her veins. The Wolf Media Group brand was legendary in the industry, a globally recognized symbol of power, innovation, and ruthless success. Redesigning it would be a monumental undertaking, a career-defining project that could either launch her into the industry's elite or destroy her reputation entirely if she failed. Our current brand identity is stagnant, Jonathan continued, leaning back in his chair with that infuriatingly calm expression. It lacks evolution. It needs fresh vision, new energy. He paused deliberately, his dark eyes boring into hers. It needs passion. I want to see your preliminary concepts by end of business Friday. Friday was 4 days away. Rebecca had worked on enough rebranding projects to know that a comprehensive proposal of this magnitude typically required months of research, competitive analysis, stakeholder interviews, and iterative development. 4 days was impossible. Completely, utterly impossible, and Jonathan knew it. She could see the challenge glinting in his eyes, the unspoken test designed specifically to make her fail, to prove that her kiss had been all impulse and no substance. "That's an extremely aggressive timeline for a project of this scope," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice professional rather than panicked. "Then I suggest you manage your time efficiently," he replied with a dismissive wave. "And you impressed me with your boldness at the Mercury Lounge, Miss Torres. Now impress me with your professional capabilities. Unless that display was all performance and no actual talent." The challenge was clear, the gauntlet thoroughly thrown. Rebecca lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly, despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I'll have the concepts ready by Friday, Mr. Wolf." "I'm counting on it," he said, that slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth again. "Close the door on your way out." For the next 4 days, Rebecca barely slept. She transformed her apartment into a war room, covering every available surface with mood boards, sketches, color studies, and competitive analyses. She consumed unholy amounts of coffee and worked through nights until her eyes burned and her hand cramped from sketching. She researched every aspect of Wolf Media Group's history, interviewed department heads via email, studied market trends and demographic shifts. She was determined not to give Jonathan Wolf the satisfaction of watching her crumble under pressure. She worked late every single night, often the last person in the building aside from Jonathan himself, who apparently lived in his office. Their interactions during this period were tense and minimal. He would walk past her desk without speaking, but she could always feel his attention on her, assessing, watching, waiting for her to break. Sometimes she'd look up from her screen to find him standing in his doorway, arms crossed, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. On Thursday night, nearly midnight, she was in his office pinning her final concepts to a large presentation board she'd commandeered from the design department. She'd narrowed her options down to 3 distinct directions. 1 evolutionary, building on the existing brand equity. 1 revolutionary, completely reimagining the visual identity. And 1 minimalist approach that stripped everything down to essential elements while feeling thoroughly modern. "You're still here," Jonathan's voice came from behind her, making her jump. She hadn't heard him enter, had been too focused on perfecting the arrangement of her presentation materials. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up to reveal surprisingly muscular forearms, his tie loosened in a way that made him look less like a corporate tyrant and more like a dangerously attractive man who'd had a long day. "The deadline is tomorrow," she replied, not quite looking at him, her voice tight with exhaustion and stress. "I wanted to make sure everything was perfect." He walked over to the presentation board, his footsteps quiet on the plush carpet, and studied her work in silence. The 3 concepts represented hundreds of hours of work compressed into 4 days, and they were brilliant. She knew they were brilliant. 1 showed bold evolution, respecting the brand's heritage while pushing it forward. The 2nd was a complete departure, risky but visually stunning. The 3rd was clean and powerful, a minimalist approach that communicated confidence and forward-thinking innovation. Jonathan was silent for so long that Rebecca's anxiety began spiraling into panic. Had she misread the assignment entirely? Were they terrible? Was he preparing to eviscerate her work and her career in 1 devastating critique? Finally, he spoke, his finger pointing to the minimalist concept. "This one, it's intelligent, it's clean, it has presence. But this typeface," he tapped the font sample, "is weak. It lacks the authority that Wolf Media Group commands. We need something with more weight, more gravitas." Rebecca felt something inside her snap, the exhaustion and stress of the past 4 days overriding her sense of self-preservation. "I disagree completely. The font choice is deliberately modern and approachable. It signals evolution, transparency, a company that's confident enough not to shout its authority. A heavier, more traditional font would be regressive. It's exactly the kind of safe, predictable choice that you said you didn't want. She turned to face him fully, her fatigue making her reckless. You asked for fresh vision and passion, Mr. Wolf. But when I give it to you, you want to control it, to force it into a box you already understand. You're a micromanager who claims to want innovation but can't handle it when someone actually delivers something outside your comfort zone. The words hung in the air between them, a shocking act of insubordination that could easily get her fired despite his previous promises. Jonathan took a step closer, invading her personal space, his tall frame towering over her 5'6" height. His dark eyes had gone even darker, intense and unreadable, and the air between them suddenly felt charged with something dangerous and electric. They were inches apart, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, could smell his cologne mixing with the faint scent of coffee and something uniquely him. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and the memory of their kiss roared back to life between them, as vivid and real as the tension crackling through the midnight office. He leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her cheek, and for one heart-stopping, terrifying, thrilling moment, Rebecca was absolutely certain he was going to kiss her again. Her body swayed toward him involuntarily, drawn by some magnetic force she couldn't control or understand. Then he abruptly pulled back, his expression snapping back into that mask of cool control, though his jaw was tight and his eyes still burned with barely suppressed intensity. "The deadline is 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Miss Torres," he said, his voice low and rough, carrying an edge that sent shivers down her spine. "Don't disappoint me." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving her standing there alone, her heart hammering violently, her body trembling with a confusing cocktail of anger, adrenaline, and undeniable, unwanted attraction to a man who held all the power over her professional future. Rebecca's minimalist concept, after a final presentation that had her hands shaking and her voice nearly failing, was selected. Jonathan, true to what was apparently his nature, took substantial credit in the company-wide announcement for guiding the strategic direction of the rebrand. But word spread quickly through industry circles, as it always did, and the design community began buzzing about the brilliant work that had clearly come from Catalyst Creative's newly promoted strategist, Rebecca Torres. Her name, which had been relatively unknown outside her small professional sphere, was suddenly appearing in trade publications and design blogs. It was a small victory, but it was hers, earned through talent and brutal hard work. The victory, however, came with an immediate and devastating consequence. Daniel, her ex-boyfriend, heard about her sudden elevation and her proximity to the billionaire CEO who'd acquired her company. The rumor mill being what it was, he quickly learned that Jonathan Wolf was the same man Rebecca had kissed so publicly at the Mercury Lounge. Consumed by a toxic mixture of jealousy, wounded pride, and petty vindictiveness, Daniel decided to strike back in the most destructive way he could conceive. One afternoon, approximately 2 weeks after the rebrand announcement, he appeared in the gleaming lobby of the Wolf Media Group headquarters. Rebecca was upstairs, deep in focus on a competitive analysis report, completely unaware of the disaster unfolding several floors below. "I'm here to see Rebecca Torres," Daniel announced loudly to the security desk, his voice carrying across the marble expanse with deliberate volume. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley, who'd been trained in professional courtesy, responded politely, "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "I don't need an appointment," Daniel said, his tone growing more aggressive and belligerent. "Rebecca and I have a personal relationship." Though I suppose that's not surprising, given how she operates. He leaned toward Ashley conspiratorially, but his voice remained loud enough for the significant foot traffic in the lobby to hear clearly. "It's amazing how quickly some women can climb the corporate ladder once they start sleeping with the boss. Quite the skill set she's developed." Ashley's professional smile faltered, shock registering on her face. Several people in the lobby stopped walking, their attention drawn to the scene unfolding at the security desk. Daniel was deliberately creating a public spectacle. attempting to humiliate Rebecca and damage her professional reputation with calculated malice. Ashley, following security protocols, discreetly pressed an alert button under her desk that simultaneously notified building security and, given the sensitive nature of the accusation, Jonathan's executive assistant. Rebecca, hearing unusual commotion and recognizing something in the distant echo of a raised male voice, walked to the glass wall separating the executive floor from the central atrium. She looked down through the transparent barrier and felt her stomach drop to the floor. Daniel, making a scene. In her workplace. She couldn't hear his exact words from this distance, but his aggressive body language and the shocked faces of people in the lobby told her everything she needed to know. Before she could move, before she could even process how to handle this nightmare scenario, Jonathan emerged from his office. His face was a mask of cold fury, the kind of controlled rage that was infinitely more terrifying than shouting. He'd clearly been listening through his assistant's intercom feed, had heard every vile word Daniel had spewed. "Stay here," he commanded Rebecca, his voice a low, dangerous growl that left no room for argument. He didn't wait for the elevator. Instead, he took the dramatic floating staircase that connected the executive floor to the main lobby, descending with measured, deliberate steps that commanded every eye in the building. His presence was overwhelming, filling the vast space with barely contained menace. Every person in the lobby stopped what they were doing to watch, sensing that something significant was about to occur. Jonathan walked directly up to Daniel, stopping precisely 3 feet away, his posture perfectly controlled but radiating threat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority was absolute, his power palpable. "You must be Mr. Ashford," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the lobby noise like a blade through silk. Daniel attempted confidence, puffing up his chest slightly. "Daniel, actually." "And you must be—" "I don't care what your name is," Jonathan interrupted, his voice dropping even lower, forcing Daniel to lean in slightly to hear him clearly. "Miss Torres is currently engaged in critical strategic work that is integral to this company's future success. Her talent and dedication are exceptional, and her value to this organization cannot be overstated. You, on the other hand, are trespassing on private property and publicly harassing one of my most valued employees." He took a single step forward, and Daniel instinctively stepped back, his false bravado cracking. "This is the only warning you will receive," Jonathan continued, his words measured and precise, each one carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Security will escort you from this building immediately. If you ever set foot in this building again, if you ever attempt to contact Miss Torres again through any means, if I even hear that you've spoken her name in a public forum, I will deploy the full resources of Wolf Media Group's legal department. We will systematically dismantle your career, your reputation, and your financial stability with such precision that you will spend the remainder of your professional life wishing you had never heard the name Rebecca Torres. Am I being absolutely clear?" Daniel had gone pale, visibly trembling now, all his aggressive bluster evaporated in the face of real power, wielded by someone who had the resources and will to make good on every threat. He could only nod, his voice apparently having deserted him entirely. "Excellent," Jonathan said, turning his back dismissively as 2 security officers appeared to escort Daniel out. But before returning to the stairs, Jonathan looked up to where Rebecca stood watching from the executive floor, her hand pressed against the glass, her face a mixture of shock and something else, something complicated. Their eyes met across the distance, and the cold, lethal fury in his expression softened just fractionally, replaced by something that looked concerningly like protectiveness. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice just loud enough to carry up to her. She could only nod, her throat tight with a confusing tangle of emotions she couldn't begin to sort through. He hadn't used this situation to mock her or remind her of her reckless behavior at the bar. He hadn't blamed her or suggested she'd brought this on herself through poor judgment. Instead, he'd defended her, with overwhelming force, protected her reputation and her dignity with the ruthless efficiency of someone defending something he considered his to protect. And that realization was simultaneously the most confusing and thrilling thing Rebecca had ever experienced. In the aftermath of the lobby incident, something fundamental shifted between them. The unspoken rules of their strange dynamic had been rewritten. Jonathan's public, fierce defense of Rebecca became office legend within hours, the story growing with each retelling. The gossip about her supposedly sleeping her way to her new position died almost immediately, replaced by a kind of awed respect. If the CEO himself had defended her so absolutely, publicly dismantled someone who'd challenged her character, then clearly there was more to Rebecca Torres than anyone had initially assumed. For Rebecca, the incident had cracked something open inside her carefully maintained walls. Jonathan was still demanding, still exacting, still her controlling boss who expected perfection in everything. But he'd also been her protector, her defender, treating her not as a subordinate to be used, but as someone valuable enough to shield without hesitation. The animosity she'd been clinging to, the professional resentment, began eroding in the face of this more complex reality. Their working relationship evolved over the following weeks into something neither could quite define. 3 weeks after the Daniel incident, Jonathan made an announcement that caught her completely off guard. "Pack appropriately for a week," he said one Monday morning, walking into her workspace without preamble as was his habit. "We're going to Tokyo. There's a major media summit, and I need your strategic input on several potential partnerships. We leave Thursday." The trip to Tokyo was a sensory overload wrapped in professional necessity. The city was a fascinating collision of ancient tradition and hypermodern innovation. Neon-lit streets, giving way to peaceful temple gardens. The air filled with a constant hum of energy and possibility. During business hours, they were the picture of professional efficiency. They attended the summit together, moving through high-stakes meetings and networking events with a synergy that surprised them both. They debated potential partnerships over conference tables, challenged each other's strategic assessments, and discovered their minds worked in complementary ways that made them formidable as a team. Rebecca's creative thinking balanced Jonathan's analytical approach, while his business acumen grounded her more experimental ideas. But at night, the carefully maintained professional boundaries began to blur in dangerous ways. Under the pretense of relationship-building dinners and cultural research, they explored the city together. They ate at a tiny ramen shop, tucked down an alley in Shibuya, arguing playfully about whether traditional advertising still had relevance in the age of social media. They walked through the serene paths of the Meiji Shrine at dusk, the sounds of the city fading to peaceful silence around them. They found themselves in a karaoke bar in Roppongi at midnight, laughing as Jonathan revealed a surprisingly decent singing voice, and Rebecca discovered she was terrible at Japanese pop songs, but enthusiastic nonetheless. For stretches of time, Rebecca would forget the power imbalance between them, forget that he was her boss and she was his employee. He was just Jonathan, a man with a sharp wit and unexpected moments of vulnerability, someone who admitted he'd never traveled for pleasure, only for business, someone who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on everything from architecture to philosophy. She learned about the driven boy who'd built a media empire from nothing after his father lost everything in a bad investment when Jonathan was 19. He learned about the creative girl who'd wanted to be an artist, but had chosen the practical path of marketing to support her family when her mother got sick. They talked for hours, stripping away the corporate personas to reveal the complicated humans underneath. The breaking point came on their last night in Tokyo. After a successful day finalizing a major partnership agreement, they returned to their hotel, a luxurious property in Minato, with a stunning rooftop garden overlooking the glittering Tokyo skyline. Jonathan suggested they have a drink to celebrate the successful trip, and Rebecca found herself following him up to the rooftop rather than retreating to the safety of her room. The night air was crisp and cool, the city spread out below them like a blanket of stars brought down to earth. Jonathan poured them both sake from a bottle he'd acquired somewhere, and they sat on a bench surrounded by carefully manicured bonsai trees and the soft sound of a water feature. "A successful week," Jonathan said, handing her a small ceramic cup. "You were exceptional in those negotiations. The way you read the room, adjusted the pitch in real time, I was impressed." "Thank you," Rebecca said, genuinely pleased by the praise. "We work well together. The partnership we secured could be transformative for Wolf Media Group's Asian market presence." They sipped their sake in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of distant traffic and city life creating a pleasant ambient backdrop. Then Jonathan spoke again, his voice quieter, more hesitant than she'd ever heard it. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." He turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights. "That night at the Mercury Lounge, why did you choose me out of everyone in that bar? Why did you kiss me?" It was the first time he'd directly addressed the kiss since that initial confrontation in his office. The question was genuine, stripped of mockery or power play, just honest curiosity from a man who seemed genuinely uncertain of the answer. Rebecca looked out at the Tokyo skyline, gathering her thoughts, deciding how much truth to offer. "I was hurt and angry," she admitted softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her sake cup. "Daniel had just humiliated me in front of people I knew. I wanted to hurt him back, to show him that I wasn't what he'd reduced me to. And you," she paused, finally meeting Jonathan's intense gaze. "You looked powerful, untouchable, like someone who'd never been hurt, never been made to feel small. I thought if I could claim even a moment of that power, I could take back some of what Daniel had stolen from me." Jonathan was silent for a long moment, something flickering across his features that looked almost like pain. "I've been hurt," he said quietly, surprising her with the admission. "I've been made to feel small. Power doesn't make you immune to pain, Rebecca. It just makes you better at hiding it." The vulnerability in his voice cracked something open in her chest. This wasn't the CEO, the corporate titan, the man who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. This was just Jonathan, admitting to being human, to carrying wounds he kept hidden beneath expensive suits and controlled expressions. He moved closer on the bench, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. "And what if I kissed you now, Rebecca?" he murmured, his voice dropping to that low, rough register that made her skin prickle with awareness. "No revenge, no games, no audience to perform for, just us. Would you let me?" Her breath caught in her throat, her heart suddenly hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. This was the precipice, the moment that would either change everything or destroy what fragile professional relationship they'd managed to build. His hand came up slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, to refuse, to maintain the boundaries that should exist between them. His fingers gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with surprising tenderness, and his eyes searched hers with an intensity that stole whatever rational thoughts she might have had left. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible even in the quiet of the rooftop garden. Jonathan leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, his other hand coming to rest at her waist. His lips were a breath away from hers, so close she could feel the ghost of contact, the promise of something that had been building between them since that first impulsive kiss. Her eyes fluttered closed, her body leaning into him in surrender to the inevitable. And then he stopped. He released a sharp, frustrated breath that bordered on a growl and suddenly pulled back, his hands dropping away from her as though she'd burned him. He stood abruptly from the bench, putting several feet of distance between them, his back turned as he gripped the rooftop railing with white-knuckled intensity. "We have an early flight," he said, his voice strained and harsh, completely void of the warmth that had been there moments before. "You should get some rest. We have a full day of meetings when we return to New York." He didn't look at her again, didn't offer any explanation for his sudden withdrawal. He walked away toward the rooftop elevator, leaving her sitting alone on the bench, her body trembling with unfulfilled desire and confused hurt, her lips aching for a kiss that had been promised and then cruelly, inexplicably denied. She sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the Tokyo skyline through tear-blurred eyes, trying to understand what had just happened and why it hurt so much more than it should. The flight back from Tokyo was torturous. They sat across the aisle from each other in first class, an unbridgeable distance despite the physical proximity. The almost kiss hung between them like a ghost, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. Jonathan buried himself in work, his laptop screen a barrier, his expression closed and unreadable. Rebecca pretended to sleep, her mind replaying that moment on the rooftop endlessly, trying to understand why he'd pulled away, what she'd done wrong, why someone who'd seemed to want her so badly had suddenly rejected her so completely. Back in New York, Jonathan retreated into an even more distant, demanding version of himself. He worked obsessively, his interactions with Rebecca becoming clipped, formal, strictly professional to the point of being cold. It was as though he was trying to erase the intimacy they'd built in Tokyo, to reconstruct the walls he'd almost allowed to crumble. He assigned her increasingly complex projects with impossible deadlines. His criticism became sharper, his expectations even more exacting. Rebecca, hurt and confused, withdrew into her own protective shell, focusing on her work with grim determination and trying to ignore the constant ache of rejection. Weeks passed in this tense, painful stalemate. Then, one afternoon while organizing Jonathan's chaotic calendar as part of her executive liaison duties, Rebecca noticed something unusual. It was a recurring appointment, blocked out for 3 hours every second Tuesday of the month. Unlike his other meticulously labeled commitments, board meetings and acquisition calls and investor briefings, this one was marked with just a single word: foundation. Curiosity prickled at the edges of her consciousness. Foundation could mean anything, but something about the way it appeared in his calendar, isolated and unelaborated, suggested it was significant. Maybe it was routine. Maybe it was nothing. But Rebecca had worked closely enough with Jonathan over the past months to recognize patterns, and this stood out as deliberately obscured. Her analytical mind, trained to spot inconsistencies and hidden narratives in branding strategies, began working on this puzzle despite her better judgment. During a quiet afternoon when Jonathan was locked in a lengthy board meeting, Rebecca did something she knew crossed ethical lines. She opened a private browser window and typed the word foundation along with Jonathan's name into the search engine, her heart beating faster with the transgression. The results that populated her screen made her breath catch. The Wolf Foundation wasn't mentioned prominently on any official Wolf Media Group materials. It was a separate entity, privately funded, focused on a very specific cause, supporting research and care facilities for degenerative neurological diseases, particularly ALS. Rebecca clicked through several links, her hands trembling slightly as pieces began connecting. She found an obscure article from a medical research journal, 5 years old, discussing major anonymous donors to the Northeast Regional ALS Center. The article carefully avoided naming the donor directly, but referenced a prominent media executive whose family was personally affected by this devastating disease. Further searching led her to a memorial announcement from 6 years prior, a small item in the obituaries that she almost missed. Eleanor Marie Wolfe, age 58, passed away peacefully after a courageous battle with ALS, survived by her son Jonathan. The realization hit Rebecca like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She leaned back in her chair, her vision blurring as the full picture assembled itself with devastating clarity. Jonathan's mother. He'd watched his mother die from ALS, a disease that slowly, cruelly robs people of the ability to move, to speak, to breathe, while leaving their minds perfectly intact to witness their own deterioration. He would have been powerless to stop it, unable to control or fix or buy his way out of her suffering, despite all his resources and intelligence. She understood suddenly, with piercing clarity, why control was so essential to him. Why he demanded perfection in every aspect of his professional life. Why he'd built an empire with such ruthless focus. It wasn't arrogance or simple ambition. It was armor, a fortress constructed around the memory of being utterly helpless while someone he loved was taken from him by something he couldn't fight or negotiate with or overcome through sheer force of will. And the foundation visits, 3 hours every second Tuesday. He was probably volunteering, or visiting patients, or funding research, forcing himself to return regularly to the source of his deepest trauma in an attempt to create meaning from his loss. Rebecca's throat tightened with emotion, tears burning behind her eyes. All the anger and resentment she'd carried, all the frustration with his controlling behavior and emotional distance, it evaporated in the face of this understanding. She wasn't just an employee he was toying with. She was a variable he couldn't predict, an emotion he was terrified of feeling again, because he knew from brutal experience that caring deeply about someone meant giving them the power to destroy you, whether through betrayal or through the simple, terrible randomness of illness and death. He hadn't pulled back from kissing her in Tokyo to punish her or play games. He'd pulled back to protect himself from the risk of caring, from the vulnerability that came with genuine connection. She looked toward his closed office door, and for the first time, she didn't see her boss or her tormentor. She saw a man still carrying a wound so deep it shaped every decision he made, a man who was profoundly, devastatingly alone by choice, because being alone felt safer than risking another loss. The discovery fundamentally changed how Rebecca saw everything about their dynamic. 2 weeks later, she noticed the date on her calendar, the second Tuesday of the month. Jonathan's foundation appointment. She watched him throughout that morning, noticing what she'd been too self-absorbed to see before. He was different on these days. More withdrawn, his jaw tighter, his movements more controlled, as though he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. He was sharp with everyone, his temper shorter, his criticism harsher than usual. He rejected 3 different project proposals before noon, finding fault with work that would normally have been acceptable. "This is completely inadequate," he snapped at her, throwing a market analysis report onto her desk around 1 o'clock. "The demographic breakdown is surface level at best. I need depth, Rebecca, not superficial observations that any first-year analyst could produce. Do it again." The old Rebecca would have defended her work, would have argued that his criticism was unfair. The new Rebecca, who understood what day this was and what he was preparing to face, simply nodded. "I'll revise it and have it back to you by tomorrow," she said quietly. Her eyes meeting his with understanding he didn't realize she possessed. Something in her tone, or perhaps her lack of defensive reaction, made him pause. He looked at her more closely, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to read her thoughts. But then he simply turned and walked back into his office, closing the door with more force than necessary. That afternoon, he left early, which was extraordinarily unusual for a man who typically worked until well past normal business hours. "I have an appointment," he told his assistant curtly. "I'll be unavailable for the rest of the day." Rebecca watched through the glass wall as he gathered his things, noticing the way his shoulders were tense, the way he avoided eye contact with everyone, the way he moved like a man preparing for battle. She made a decision in that moment, an impulsive choice driven by the same reckless instinct that had led her to kiss him in that bar months ago. She stayed at the office long after everyone else had left, working on genuine projects but also waiting, her stomach in knots, second-guessing herself every 5 minutes. Hours passed. The sun set, painting the Manhattan skyline in shades of orange and purple before fading to darkness. The office became a silent space of shadows and emergency lighting, empty except for the security guards making their rounds. She heard the private elevator chime around 9 o'clock and felt her heart jump into her throat. She listened as his footsteps approached, slow and heavy, completely unlike his usual confident stride. He appeared in the doorway to the executive suite, looking utterly depleted in a way she'd never witnessed before. His suit jacket was missing. His tie was loosened and pulled askew. His shirt was partially untucked. And he looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of the evening had physically diminished him. He didn't notice her at first, walking directly toward his office in the darkness. But then he must have sensed movement or seen the glow of her computer screen, because he stopped abruptly and turned. "What are you still doing here?" His voice was rough, scraped raw with emotion he was barely containing. "I thought everyone had gone home." "They did," Rebecca said softly, standing up from her desk. "I stayed. I thought you might not want to be alone tonight." His face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, suspicion, realization, and finally something that looked like fear mixed with desperate hope. "You don't need to babysit me, Rebecca. I'm fine. I'm always fine." "No, you're not," she said gently, walking toward him slowly, carefully, as though approaching something wounded and dangerous. "And that's okay. You don't have to be fine, Jonathan. Not tonight. Not with me." She watched his carefully constructed armor, weakened by whatever he'd endured at the foundation, begin to crack. His jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid with the effort of maintaining control. "Today is the anniversary," he said finally, the words seeming to tear themselves from somewhere deep in his chest. 6 years ago today, my mother died. I was holding her hand, and she couldn't speak anymore, couldn't move, could barely breathe. But her eyes were still her, still aware, still fighting. And I couldn't do anything. I had money, connections, access to the best doctors in the world, and I couldn't save her. I couldn't even make her comfortable. I just had to watch her suffocate slowly, while I held her hand and pretended to be strong. His voice broke on the last word, and Rebecca saw his eyes fill with tears he'd probably been holding back for hours, maybe years. This was the core wound, the source of all his need for control, all his emotional distance. He'd been forced to be strong while experiencing complete powerlessness, and that contradiction had shaped him into someone who controlled everything possible to avoid ever feeling that helpless again. "She was everything," he continued, his voice raw and broken, words spilling out now that the dam had cracked. "After my father's business collapsed and he drank himself to death, it was just her and me. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat while I was in college. She believed in me when I had nothing. And when she got sick, when she needed me, I built this empire trying to earn enough money to fix her. But you can't buy time, Rebecca. You can't negotiate with death. All my power meant nothing." Rebecca closed the remaining distance between them, her eyes stinging with tears for his pain, for the lonely boy who'd become a lonely man, armored against the world. She didn't offer empty platitudes or useless sympathy. She simply reached out and took his hand, the same way she'd done once before. His hand was cold, trembling slightly, but his grip was fierce, clinging to her as though she were the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself unstable and cruel. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, and the last of his defenses crumbled. The tears he'd been holding back spilled over, running down his face unchecked, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs he'd probably never allowed himself to release. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly as he finally let himself break. He buried his face against her shoulder, his arms coming around her with desperate strength, and he wept. For his mother, for his powerlessness, for 6 years of grief he'd carried alone, for every moment he'd forced himself to be strong when what he'd needed was permission to be human. Rebecca held him through it all, one hand stroking his back, the other tangled in his hair, murmuring wordless comfort against his temple. They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd started as adversaries finding unexpected solace in each other's arms. When his tears finally subsided, Jonathan didn't pull away immediately. He stayed there, his face still pressed against her shoulder, his breathing gradually steadying. "I'm sorry," he whispered eventually. "You shouldn't have to see me like this." "Jonathan, look at me," Rebecca said softly, waiting until he lifted his head, his eyes red and raw but also somehow lighter, as though releasing that grief had created space for something else. "You don't have to apologize for being human. You don't have to be strong and controlled and perfect every single moment. It's okay to hurt. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to need someone." He searched her face, his expression vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache. "I don't know how to need someone," he admitted. "I've spent so long making sure I don't need anyone that I don't remember what it feels like to let someone in." "And then maybe it's time to learn," she said, her hand coming up to cup his cheek, her thumb gently wiping away the tear tracks on his face. "Because shutting everyone out, controlling everything, building walls around your heart, it's not protecting you, Jonathan. It's just making you alone." The truth of her words seemed to hit him hard. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, and when he opened them again, there was something different there. A decision, a surrender, a willingness to take a risk he'd been avoiding for years. "I'm terrified," he whispered. "Of what?" "Of this. Of you. Of caring about someone and losing them. Of being powerless again." His voice was barely audible, the admission clearly costing him dearly. Rebecca's heart squeezed with emotion so intense it was almost painful. "I'm terrified too," she admitted. "You have all the power in our professional relationship. You could destroy my career with a phone call. You've already seen me at my worst. See me make the most impulsive, ridiculous decision of my life. Every time I start to feel something for you, I remind myself that this is probably the worst idea I've ever had." "Probably?" he asked, the ghost of a smile touching his lips despite everything. "Definitely," she corrected, managing a small laugh through her own tears. "But I'm starting to think that maybe the worst ideas sometimes lead to the most important things, because despite all the reasons this is complicated and messy and potentially disastrous, I can't seem to stop caring about you." The confession hung between them, brave and terrifying. Jonathan stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers as though trying to verify the truth of what she'd said. Then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind or pull away, he leaned in. This time, there was no hesitation, no pulling back at the last moment. His lips met hers in a kiss that was completely different from their first encounter. That kiss had been weapons and performance and fury. This was surrender. It was slow, tentative, and filled with all the unspoken words, all the carefully guarded feelings, all the vulnerability they'd both been trying so hard to hide. It was a confession of need, an admission of fear, a promise to try despite all the reasons it might not work. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, while his other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer against him. Rebecca's hands found their way to his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palms, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. The kiss deepened, months of tension and denial, and carefully suppressed attraction pouring out in that single point of contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonathan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his expression peaceful in a way she'd never seen. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to be someone's partner instead of their boss. I don't know how to stop trying to control everything. I don't know how to trust that caring about someone won't destroy me." "Neither do I," Rebecca whispered back. "But maybe we can figure it out together." "Together," he repeated, as though testing the word, finding it both foreign and appealing. Yes. Together. He opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, without any of his usual armor in place. This is going to be complicated, you know. The power dynamics, the office politics, the fact that we started this whole thing in possibly the most dysfunctional way imaginable. I know, Rebecca acknowledged, but I'm tired of making decisions based on fear of what might go wrong. Maybe it's time to make a decision based on what might go right. Something shifted in Jonathan's expression, a lightness that hadn't been there before, as though her words had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for far too long. He kissed her again, gentler this time, sweeter. A kiss that tasted like possibility and new beginnings and the courage to take risks despite the fear. They stayed in that quiet office for hours, talking in ways they never had before, sharing stories and fears and dreams without the professional filters they usually maintained. Jonathan told her about his mother's sense of humor, the way she'd taught him to see business not as warfare but as problem-solving. The last coherent words she'd managed to type on her communication device, "Be brave enough to be happy." Rebecca told him about her own mother's illness, the breast cancer that had reshaped her entire family, the reason she'd given up art school to pursue something more financially stable, the guilt she still carried about choosing practicality over passion. They discovered their scars matched in unexpected ways. Two people who'd learned to protect themselves, ending up isolated in their safety. As dawn began painting the sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Rebecca found herself curled against Jonathan on the leather sofa in his office, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. It wasn't romantic in a conventional sense. They were both exhausted and emotionally wrung out, but it was intimate in a way that mattered more. It was trust, the kind that only comes from seeing someone at their most vulnerable and choosing to stay anyway. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked quietly, as the city began waking up around them. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns on her shoulder. "Honestly, I have no idea. But I know I don't want to go back to pretending I don't care about you. I don't want to go back to keeping you at arm's length to protect myself. I think we try this, whatever this is, and we figure it out as we go." "That's very un-CEO-like of you," Rebecca said with a small smile. "Not having a detailed strategic plan with contingencies and projected outcomes. You're a terrible influence on me," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "You keep making me act on feelings instead of logic. It's deeply uncomfortable, and somehow also the best thing that's happened to me in years." "Good," Rebecca said, tilting her head up to look at him. "Why, because I plan to keep being a terrible influence for a while." "I'm counting on it," he said, leaning down to kiss her once more as the sun rose over Manhattan, painting them both in golden light. Two complicated people deciding to take a chance on something even more complicated but infinitely more valuable than safety. "Hey, are you still with me? Because this story is about to take some turns that will absolutely shock you. If you're invested in Rebecca and Jonathan's journey, you need to subscribe right now so you don't miss what happens when their relationship becomes public knowledge and the office politics get brutal. Hit that subscribe button because what comes next is going to test everything they just promised each other. Trust me, you'll want to see this." The morning after their breakthrough was surprisingly uncomplicated. Rebecca and Jonathan had both gone home around 6 to shower and change before returning to the office at their usual times, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But everything felt different now. The tension that had existed between them for months had transformed from antagonistic to anticipatory. They were careful, professional, but there were small moments that revealed the shift. His hand lingering a second too long when passing her documents. Her catching him looking at her through the glass walls with an expression that was warm rather than critical. A shared smile over an inside joke from their late-night conversation that no one else would understand. But secrets in a corporate environment have a remarkably short half-life, especially when the principals involved can't quite hide what's changed. It started with small observations. Jonathan's assistant, Patricia, noticed that his mood had improved dramatically, that the edge of irritation that had characterized his behavior for weeks had softened. Rebecca's former colleagues in the creative department whispered about how she seemed lighter, less stressed despite her demanding position. And people who paid attention to such things noticed that the CEO and his executive liaison seemed to have developed a rapport that went beyond professional courtesy. The rumors started quietly, speculatively, but gained momentum with each passing day. They were careful never to display obvious affection at work, never to let their personal connection interfere with professional responsibilities. But careful isn't the same as invisible, and people who wanted to see evidence of impropriety found it in every interaction. The whispers grew louder, meaner, fueled by jealousy and the human tendency to reduce complex relationships to the most salacious interpretation. Rebecca's continued proximity to Jonathan, her influence on major projects, her rapid rise within the company, all of it was retroactively reframed through the lens of a presumed affair. The primary instigator was Richard Morrison, the VP of Digital Strategy who'd been passed over for several high-profile projects in favor of Rebecca's input. He was a man who'd spent 15 years building his position within the company, only to watch a relative newcomer gain access and influence that he felt should have been his. His resentment metastasized into active sabotage, spreading poisonous speculation disguised as concern. "I'm just saying, it's interesting timing," he'd murmur to anyone who'd listen in the break room or after meetings. She shows up in his bed, and suddenly she's got her fingerprints on every major initiative. That's not merit, that's manipulation. The comments were careful, just ambiguous enough to provide deniability, but their impact was devastating. Rebecca's legitimately excellent work was dismissed as the product of pillow talk rather than talent. Her ideas were attributed to Jonathan's influence rather than her own creativity. Colleagues who'd respected her began treating her with subtle condescension or outright hostility. The situation came to a head after a particularly successful presentation. Rebecca had led a pitch for a revolutionary approach to integrated media campaigns that would position Wolf Media Group at the forefront of the industry's digital transformation. The presentation had been brilliant, a culmination of months of research and strategic thinking, and it had won immediate approval from the executive board, with Jonathan notably abstaining from the vote to avoid any appearance of bias. But instead of celebration, Rebecca returned to her desk to find the atmosphere toxic. She overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear, Richard's voice carrying from around the corner of a cubicle wall. "And of course they approved it. Wolf already told them to. She probably workshopped the pitch in bed. It's embarrassing, honestly, watching everyone pretend this is about her talent when we all know what's really happening. She's sleeping her way to the top, and Wolf is thinking with something other than his brain." The crude comment, delivered with casual cruelty and meant to be overheard, was a knife between Rebecca's ribs. It invalidated every late night, every ounce of creative energy, every bit of strategic thinking she'd poured into that presentation. She stood frozen behind the partition, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes burning with humiliated tears she absolutely refused to shed in the office. She'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to have her accomplishments reduced to sexual favors by a bitter man who couldn't accept that she was simply better at the work than he was. But the damage was done. By end of day, the comment had spread through the office gossip network, growing uglier with each retelling. People looked at her differently now, their respect replaced by speculation or judgment. Her success, earned through genuine ability and relentless effort, had been tainted by the relationship she'd chosen to pursue. And the crushing realization hit her. As long as she worked for Jonathan, as long as she was employed by Wolf Media Group, she would never be seen as anything more than the CEO's girlfriend. Her professional identity would always be overshadowed by their personal connection. That evening, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at a blank document on her laptop screen, her cursor blinking in the space where she needed to type words that would break her heart. She loved Jonathan. She'd admitted that to herself, if not yet out loud to him. But she also loved her work, her independence, the pride that came from knowing her success was her own. And she was being forced to choose between them in a way that felt fundamentally unjust. Around 8 o'clock, her phone rang. Jonathan's name lit up the screen, and she almost didn't answer, but avoiding him would only delay the inevitable conversation. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I heard what Morrison said." Jonathan's voice came through, tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm going to fire him." Effective immediately. He crossed a line that's absolutely unacceptable, and I won't tolerate that kind of toxic behavior in my company. "No," Rebecca said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Jonathan, you can't. Don't you see? If you fire him, it proves his point. It makes me the woman who gets people fired because she's sleeping with the boss. It makes everything worse. So what? I'm supposed to let him disrespect you? Spread lies about your work? I won't do it, Rebecca. I won't stand by while people diminish your accomplishments." There was real pain in his voice, the frustration of someone discovering that his power couldn't fix this problem, that in fact his power was the problem. "I'm coming over," he said. "We need to talk about this in person." When he arrived 30 minutes later, Rebecca had made her decision. She'd typed the words she'd been avoiding, printed the document, placed it in an envelope. Jonathan took one look at her face and went pale. "No," he said immediately, recognizing what was coming. "Rebecca, no. Whatever you're thinking, we can fix this. We can find another solution." "There isn't one," she said softly, handing him the envelope. "This is my letter of resignation, effective 2 weeks from today. I'm leaving Wolf Media Group." He stared at the envelope as though it were a weapon pointed at his heart. "You can't leave. I won't accept this, Rebecca. Please, we can figure this out. I'll make a statement. I'll clarify your role. I'll restructure the entire—" "Jonathan, stop," she interrupted gently but firmly. "Your power is the problem. As long as I work for you, as long as I'm your employee, nothing I accomplish will be my own in the eyes of other people. Every success will be attributed to you. Every promotion will be questioned. Every project will be dismissed as favoritism. I worked too hard to get here to have my career defined by who I'm dating, rather than what I can do." "Then I'll step down," he said desperately, the words clearly costing him dearly. "I'll find someone else to run day-to-day operations. I'll distance myself from and sacrifice everything you've built. Give up the company you created. That's not a solution, Jonathan. That's just a different kind of martyrdom." Rebecca felt tears sliding down her cheeks despite her efforts to remain composed. "If what we have is real, if it's strong enough to matter, then it has to be able to exist outside of this power structure. I can't be your employee and your partner simultaneously. The roles are incompatible, so I have to choose, and I'm choosing my self-respect. I'm choosing to leave so that whatever I build next, wherever I go, my success is mine." Jonathan looked at her with such raw pain that it nearly broke her resolve. He'd finally allowed himself to be vulnerable, to care about someone, to take the risk of connection. And now that connection was costing him the person he'd opened up to. "So this is it?" he asked, his voice rough and broken. "You're just walking away from us." "I'm walking away from this situation," Rebecca corrected, though her voice shook with emotion. "I'm not walking away from you, Jonathan. But I need to know that I'm more than my proximity to your power. I need to build something that's mine, earn respect that isn't questioned, create success that stands independent of you. And if we're meant to be together, if this relationship is as real as it feels, then it will survive me not working for you. It has to." He stood there for a long moment, the envelope clutched in his hand, his jaw working as he processed what she was saying. She could see him cycling through responses, trying to find an argument that would change her mind, searching for a solution that didn't exist. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly in defeat. "I understand," he said quietly. though every word sounded like it was being dragged out of him against his will. I hate it, and it feels like losing you. But I understand. You're right. Your career, your reputation, your independence, they're not negotiable. I wouldn't respect you if you were willing to sacrifice them, even for me. He set the resignation letter on her coffee table, then reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. But this doesn't end us, he said fiercely against her hair. You leaving the company doesn't end us. We'll figure out how to make this work outside of those walls, outside of that power dynamic. I'm not losing you twice, Rebecca. Not when I just found the courage to let you in. I hope so, she whispered, clinging to him, breathing in his familiar scent, trying to memorize this moment. I really hope so, Jonathan. But we both need to be prepared for the possibility that maybe the circumstances that brought us together are also the things that make it impossible for us to work. They held each other for a long time, two people trying to believe they could overcome the structural problems that had defined their entire relationship. When Jonathan finally left her apartment in the early hours of the morning, Rebecca felt simultaneously heartbroken and strangely liberated. She was choosing herself, choosing her career, choosing to walk away from security and comfort in pursuit of something authentic. It was terrifying. It was also the rightest thing she'd done in months. The next morning, Rebecca submitted her formal resignation to HR, triggering the standard 2-week notice period. The news spread through the office with wildfire speed, generating speculation that ranged from sympathetic to cruel. Some assumed she'd been forced out despite the company's official statement about pursuing new opportunities. Others whispered that the relationship with Jonathan had imploded spectacularly. Richard Morrison, the source of so much toxicity, looked smugly satisfied, as though he'd personally driven her out and won some imagined competition. Jonathan called an unexpected all-hands meeting that afternoon. The entire company gathered in the main conference space, the air thick with tension and curiosity. Rebecca stood in the back, trying to be invisible, dreading whatever was about to happen. Jonathan walked to the front of the room, and the man who appeared was not the controlled CEO they were accustomed to. His armor was down, his expression open in a way that made everyone instantly uncomfortable because it was so unfamiliar. "I'm not going to pretend this is a standard corporate announcement," he began, his voice steady, but stripped of its usual commanding tone. "Many of you have heard that Rebecca Torres has resigned from her position. I want to address that directly, because I owe her, and I owe all of you, the truth." The room went completely silent, every eye focused on him. Rebecca felt her heart hammering, uncertain what he was about to say, terrified and also strangely curious. "Rebecca Torres is the most talented strategist I have ever worked with," Jonathan continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled employees. "Her contributions to this company, the rebrand, the Tokyo partnership, the integrated media campaign that was approved this week, these are her achievements, her vision, her work, her brilliance, not mine." He paused, his eyes finding Rebecca in the back of the room, holding her gaze. "Rebecca and I are in a personal relationship. That is true. And that relationship has created a situation where her very real, very earned accomplishments have been questioned and diminished by people who would rather attribute her success to our personal connection than acknowledge her genuine talent." There were shocked murmurs throughout the room. No CEO spoke this openly, this vulnerably, about personal matters. It violated every rule of corporate communication. Jonathan didn't seem to care. "Rebecca is leaving because she refuses to let her professional reputation be defined by her relationship with me," he said, his voice carrying an edge of something that sounded like pride mixed with regret. "She is leaving because she values her integrity and her independence more than she values comfort and security. That takes courage that most of us, myself included, don't possess." He shifted his attention back to the full room, his expression hardening slightly. I'm also addressing the toxic culture that has made her departure necessary. Effective immediately, Richard Morrison is no longer with this company. He is being escorted out as I speak for creating a hostile work environment through persistent harassment and defamation of a colleague. Right on cue, security guards appeared at the side door, and Rebecca caught a glimpse of Richard being led out, his face red with humiliation and anger. The message was unmistakable. Jonathan might not have been able to keep Rebecca, but he would absolutely destroy anyone who had driven her away. Moving forward, Jonathan continued, Wolf Media Group will have zero tolerance for workplace harassment, for gossip that undermines colleagues, for any behavior that values office politics over actual merit. Your work will speak for you, nothing else. If you can't operate in that environment, there's the door. The room remained silent, everyone processing the unprecedented display of raw honesty from their typically controlled CEO. Finally, Jonathan said, his voice softening, I want to say publicly what I should have said weeks ago. Rebecca, you were right about everything, about the power dynamics, about the impossibility of the situation, about choosing yourself. Thank you for having the courage I lacked, and thank you for everything you've given this company. He didn't wait for applause or questions. He simply walked off the small stage and out of the conference room, leaving behind a workforce that was stunned, confused, and suddenly re-evaluating every assumption they'd made about their CEO and the woman he'd just defended so absolutely. Rebecca stood frozen in place, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Jonathan had done something she'd never expected. He hadn't tried to control the narrative or manipulate the outcome. He'd simply told the truth, publicly validated her work, and accepted the consequences of their relationship without trying to minimize or hide it. He'd given her the professional vindication she needed while also making clear that her departure was her choice, not his abandonment. Her colleagues approached her throughout the rest of the day, many offering genuine apologies for how they'd treated her or assumptions they'd made. Some admitted they'd been jealous of her rapid success and had been too quick to attribute it to factors other than merit. Others simply expressed respect for her decision to leave, acknowledging that it took integrity they weren't sure they'd have in her position. The last 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo. Rebecca worked on transition documents, training her replacement, tying up loose ends. Jonathan maintained appropriate professional distance during business hours, but they spoke on the phone every evening, long conversations about everything and nothing, deliberately avoiding the question of what would happen after her last day. They were in uncharted territory, attempting to transform a relationship that had been fundamentally shaped by power dynamics into something equal and sustainable. On Rebecca's final day, a Friday afternoon in late autumn, she packed up her belongings from the executive anteroom she'd occupied for the past months. The space that had once felt like exile now held memories she'd carry forever. Late nights working on impossible deadlines, quiet moments of unexpected connection, the gradual evolution from antagonism to understanding to something much deeper. Jonathan appeared in the doorway around 5 o'clock, long after most employees had left for the weekend. So this is it, he said quietly, leaning against the frame, his hands in his pockets. Your great escape. My new beginning, Rebecca corrected, sealing the last box of her personal items. There's a difference. I know, he acknowledged. He walked over to her, his expression vulnerable in a way that had become familiar over the past weeks. Rebecca, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen before you respond. Deal. Deal? She agreed, her heart rate picking up with anticipation and nervousness. And when you're ready, when you've had time to build whatever comes next for you, I want to invest in you, he said, not as your boss, not as someone with power over you. As a business partner who recognizes extraordinary talent, I want you to start your own agency, your own company, something that's entirely yours. I'll provide the capital, the connections, the resources. But it will be your vision, your leadership, your success. No strings attached except the standard investor agreement. Rebecca stared at him, stunned by the proposal. Jonathan, let me finish, he interrupted gently. I'm not offering this because we're in a relationship. I'm offering it because you're brilliant. Because you have ideas that could transform this industry. And because you deserve the opportunity to build something without anyone being able to question whether you earned it. If we weren't together, if we'd never kissed in that bar, I would still be trying to find a way to keep your talent connected to Wolf Media Group's orbit. You're just that good. He pulled out a manila folder and set it on her now empty desk. This is a proposal for an independent creative agency. I had my team draw it up. You'd be CEO, you'd have full operational control, you'd build your own staff. Wolf Media Group would be your first client and primary investor, but you'd be free to work with anyone, including our competitors. You wouldn't report to me. You'd be my equal, my peer, my partner, in the truest sense. Rebecca opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the business proposal. It was comprehensive, professional, and incredibly generous. The proposed capital investment would give her everything she needed to launch a competitive agency immediately. The client agreement would provide stable revenue without restricting her independence. The equity structure ensured she maintained majority ownership and complete creative control. It was everything she would have dreamed of if she dared to dream that big. That you had this prepared before I even resigned, she realized, noticing the dates on the documents. You were planning this the entire time. I was preparing for every contingency, Jonathan admitted, including the one where you were brave enough to choose yourself over comfort. I couldn't keep you in a situation that diminished you, Rebecca, but I could make sure that you leaving didn't mean I lost access to your genius. This way, we're partners, equals, no power imbalance, no questionable dynamics, just two professionals who respect each other's abilities and happen to also be figuring out a personal relationship. Rebecca looked up from the proposal, her eyes searching his face. And if the personal relationship doesn't work? If we try this and discover that maybe we were better as adversaries or colleagues than as an actual couple, then you'd still have your agency, Jonathan said simply. The business arrangement isn't contingent on our personal relationship working out. The investment offer stands regardless, because your talent isn't dependent on whether we're together, and my interest in your success isn't limited to romantic feelings. You've earned this opportunity, Rebecca. I'm just the fortunate bastard who gets to make it possible. It was, without question, the most thoughtful, respectful, and genuinely supportive thing anyone had ever done for her. He wasn't trying to control her or keep her close through financial ties. He was giving her the resources to succeed independently, while creating a professional framework that would allow them to continue working together without the toxic power dynamic that had forced her departure. I have one condition, Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. Name it. No special treatment because we're involved personally. If my work isn't meeting standards, if my agency isn't delivering value, you evaluate me exactly as you would any other contractor or partner. I want this to succeed because I'm actually that good, not because you're making allowances for me. Jonathan smiled, a genuine warm expression that transformed his usually serious face. Deal. Though I should warn you, I'm a demanding client. I'll probably be your most difficult account. I wouldn't expect anything less, Rebecca replied, matching his smile. She looked down at the proposal again, then back at him. Okay, let's do this. Let's build something extraordinary. We already did, Jonathan said softly, stepping closer and framing her face with his hands. Everything else is just expansion. He kissed her, then, sweet and deep and full of promise. It tasted like new beginnings, like equal partnerships, like two complicated people who'd found each other through chaos and had the courage to build something real from a foundation that should have crumbled, but somehow, against all odds, had become stronger than either of them alone. 3 months later, Torres creative agency opened in a renovated loft space in Brooklyn, far enough from Wolf Media Group's Manhattan headquarters to be clearly independent, but connected enough to maintain the partnership. Rebecca had assembled a small but incredibly talented team of designers, strategists, and innovators who'd been drawn by her vision for ethical, emotionally intelligent brand development. Her first project, naturally, was for Wolf Media Group, a comprehensive campaign that would become an industry case study for innovative integrated marketing. But she also landed 3 other major clients in her first month: a tech startup, a sustainable fashion brand, and a nonprofit focused on education reform. Her reputation spread quickly, built not on her connection to Jonathan Wolf, but on the undeniable quality of her work. Jonathan kept his promise. He was her most demanding client, pushing her team to their limits, never accepting anything less than exceptional. But he also respected her boundaries, never trying to leverage their personal relationship to influence business decisions. When they disagreed on creative direction, which was frequently, they argued it out based on strategy and data, not personal dynamics. They were partners in the truest sense, 2 equals who challenged each other to be better. Their personal relationship evolved more slowly, more carefully, both of them conscious of not repeating the mistakes that had characterized their beginning. They dated like normal people, dinners and movies and long walks through the city. Jonathan met Rebecca's mother, sitting through a slightly uncomfortable interrogation over Sunday dinner and winning her over with unexpected charm and genuine respect. Rebecca was introduced to Jonathan's small circle of actual friends. The few people who'd known him before wealth and power had complicated all his relationships. They talked about their mothers, both gone too soon, finding solace in shared understanding of loss and the different ways it shaped people. They fought sometimes, both too stubborn and opinionated to achieve perfect harmony. But they learned to fight fair, to argue without cruelty, to disagree without dismissing each other's perspectives. They learned that partnership didn't mean agreement on everything. It meant respecting each other enough to work through disagreement towards something better than either original position. 6 months after Rebecca had walked out of Wolf Media Group, Torres Creative Agency hosted a launch party to celebrate their first half-year of success. The renovated loft was packed with clients, colleagues, industry press, and friends. Rebecca stood in the center of the space she'd built, wearing a dress she'd chosen because she loved it rather than to impress anyone, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment that belonged entirely to her. Jonathan arrived fashionably late, as was his habit, and made his way through the crowd toward her. When he reached her side, he handed her a small wrapped gift. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "And you've already invested in the company. You didn't need to bring anything." "Open it," he said simply, a mysterious smile playing at his lips. Inside the elegant wrapping was a small leather portfolio, and inside that was a framed review from the industry's most respected marketing publication. The headline read, "Torres Creative, the independent agency, proving that talent speaks louder than connections." The article praised her innovative approach, her team's dedication, and specifically noted that her success was earned through exceptional work rather than proximity to power. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes as she read it. This was what she'd needed. External validation that she'd built something real, something that stood on its own merit. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Jonathan. "Not for the gift, but for letting me go, for understanding that I needed to do this on my own." "You would have found a way regardless," Jonathan replied. "That's who you are, Rebecca. You don't accept limitations or let anyone else define your worth." "It's one of the many things I love about you." The words hung in the air between them. The first time either had said that particular phrase out loud despite months of feeling it. "You love me?" Rebecca asked, her heart suddenly racing. "I love you," Jonathan confirmed. No hesitation, no qualification. "I love your talent, your integrity, your refusal to compromise yourself for anyone. I love that you challenged me from the beginning, that you never let my power intimidate you into silence." I love that you were brave enough to walk away when staying would have been easier. You're extraordinary, Rebecca Torres. And I'm grateful every day that you had terrible judgment in bars and decided to kiss a stranger." Rebecca laughed, tears and joy mixing together. "Best terrible decision I ever made," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him properly, not caring that they had an audience, not caring what anyone thought. This was her success, her agency, her life, her choice, and she was choosing him, freely and completely, in a relationship built on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. Even though you're still an impossibly demanding client who rejects half my initial concepts. Your revised concepts are always better anyway," he replied with a grin. "I'm just helping you reach your full potential." "Insufferable," she declared. But she was smiling. "Absolutely," he agreed, pulling her closer. "But I'm your insufferable partner now, in business and in life. You're stuck with me, Torres." "I can live with that," Rebecca said, and meant it completely. They stood there in the middle of her success party, two people who'd started with a desperate kiss and built something real through honesty, respect, and the courage to choose the difficult path toward genuine partnership. It wasn't the story either had planned. It wasn't conventional or simple. But it was theirs, authentically and completely theirs, and that made it perfect. 1 year later, Torres' creative agency was thriving beyond even Rebecca's ambitious projections. They'd expanded to a second location, hired 30 employees, and landed clients that included several Fortune 500 companies.
Rebecca had been profiled in major business publications, spoken at industry conferences, and established herself as an independent force in the creative world. Her success was unquestionable. Her reputation built on a foundation of exceptional work that no one could attribute to anyone but her and her team. She was exactly what she'd fought to become, a recognized professional whose accomplishments stood on their own merit.
Jonathan's company had also grown, the partnership with Torres Creative becoming a model for how major corporations could work with independent agencies to foster innovation without stifling creativity through acquisition. He'd softened somewhat, the rigid control freak mellowing into someone who could delegate and trust, though Rebecca loved to tease him that he'd never be fully reformed. One evening, Jonathan invited Rebecca to dinner at an expensive restaurant overlooking the Hudson River. She arrived to find him already seated at a private table on the terrace, the sunset painting the sky in shades of purple and gold behind him. He stood as she approached, kissing her cheek, pulling out her chair with the gentlemanly manners that contrasted so interestingly with his ruthless business persona. They ordered wine and appetizers, catching up on their respective weeks. A major client had just renewed their contract with Torres Creative with a significant expansion of scope. Jonathan had successfully negotiated the acquisition of a European media company, expanding Wolf Media Group's international footprint. They talked strategy and celebrated victories, the conversation flowing with the ease of two people who'd learned to blend their professional and personal lives without letting one overwhelm the other. After dinner, as they sat with coffee and dessert, Jonathan became uncharacteristically quiet. Rebecca noticed his knee bouncing slightly under the table. A tell she'd learned meant he was nervous about something. "What's wrong?" she asked, concerned. "Are you okay? Is it one of your foundation days?" She'd learned to recognize the pattern, offering support on the difficult anniversaries without making him feel managed or pitied. "No, nothing like that," he assured her, then took a deep breath. "Rebecca, I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I need to discuss it with you." "That sounds ominous," she said with a slight smile, trying to lighten whatever was making him so tense. "Are you terminating Torres Creative's contract? Because I should warn you, my lawyers are much better than they were a year ago." "Definitely not terminating anything," he said, managing a smile that didn't quite hide his nervousness. "Actually, I was hoping to extend our contract permanently." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, setting it on the table between them. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as she realized what was happening. "Jonathan, let me say this before I lose my nerve," he interrupted gently. "A year and a half ago, you walked into my life through the most unconventional, chaotic circumstances imaginable. You challenged everything I thought I knew about control, about power, about what it meant to build something meaningful. You forced me to confront my own fears, to risk vulnerability, to understand that the strongest partnerships are built on equality rather than dominance." He opened the box, revealing a stunning ring that was somehow both elegant and understated, classic and modern, perfectly balanced like everything about their relationship had become. "You walked away from security to protect your integrity, and in doing so, you taught me that real love means supporting someone's independence rather than trying to control it. You built something extraordinary entirely on your own merit, and watching you succeed has been one of the greatest privileges of my life." Jonathan picked up the ring, his hand remarkably steady despite the emotion evident in his voice. "Rebecca Torres, you are my equal, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. Will you marry me? Will you take on the undoubtedly challenging project of being my wife while maintaining your fierce independence and continuing to call me out when I'm being an insufferable control freak?" Rebecca was crying, laughing, overwhelmed with emotion. A year ago, she'd been terrified that their relationship couldn't survive outside the chaotic dynamic that had created it. But they'd proven that wrong. They'd built something real, something lasting, something based on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than power and proximity. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with joy. "Yes, absolutely yes, even though you're going to be impossible to live with and we'll probably try to optimize our wedding planning with spreadsheets and efficiency metrics. I've already started a project management system," Jonathan admitted with a grin, slipping the ring onto her finger. It has color-coded timelines and vendor comparison matrices." "Of course you have," Rebecca said, pulling him across the table to kiss him properly, not caring that they were in public, that people were watching, that the staff was probably going to applaud any second. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you." And they did applaud, the restaurant staff and nearby diners who'd witnessed the proposal, the sound washing over them like a blessing. Jonathan and Rebecca stayed wrapped in each other, laughing and crying and kissing, two people who'd started with a desperate act of revenge and built something beautiful through honesty, courage, and the willingness to fight for each other even when it meant fighting against the circumstances that had brought them together. "I love you," Jonathan whispered against her lips. "Even when you reject my creative concepts." "Especially then," Rebecca corrected. "That's when I'm making you better." "Always making me better," he agreed. "That's what you do. That's what we do for each other." 6 months later, they married in a ceremony that perfectly reflected their journey. Not a traditional church wedding or an ostentatious display of wealth, but an intimate gathering in a converted industrial space that looked remarkably like Rebecca's agency, filled with exposed brick, natural light, and the creative energy that defined both their professional lives. The guest list was small but meaningful. Close friends and family who'd supported them through the complicated evolution of their relationship. Rebecca's mother cried through the entire ceremony. Jonathan's colleagues from the foundation attended, people who knew the side of him he rarely showed the business world. The Torres creative team celebrated alongside Wolf Media Group executives, two companies that had learned to work together as partners rather than hierarchy. Rebecca walked herself down the aisle because she'd never needed anyone to give her away. She'd always belonged to herself first. She wore a dress that was both elegant and unconventional, designed by the sustainable fashion brand that had been one of her first independent clients. Jonathan waited for her at the altar wearing a perfectly tailored suit, but with a tie that was slightly crooked, a deliberate imperfection that made her smile because it showed he was nervous, human, real. Their vows were honest to the point of being uncomfortable for some guests. Jonathan acknowledged the problematic beginning of their relationship, the power dynamics that could have destroyed them, his own need for control that had nearly cost him everything meaningful. Rebecca spoke about fear and courage, about the difficulty of choosing yourself when staying would be easier, about learning that real love supports independence rather than demanding surrender. They promised not perfection, but effort. Not complete agreement, but respectful disagreement. Not a relationship without conflict, but a commitment to fight fair and always choose each other, even when it was difficult. "I promise to challenge you when you need it," Rebecca said, her voice steady and clear. "I promise to let you challenge me without trying to control the outcome," Jonathan replied. "I promise to build my own success and never let our relationship diminish my independence," Rebecca continued. "I promise to celebrate your success without taking credit or feeling threatened by it," Jonathan answered. "I promise to be your partner, your equal, your best friend," they said together, in business, in life, in everything. When they kissed as married partners, the applause was thunderous, joyful, celebratory of a couple who'd earned their happiness through sheer stubborn determination to do things right, even when doing things right was complicated and difficult. The reception was held in Torres Creative's original loft space, transformed for the evening into a celebration venue that honored both their professional accomplishments and personal journey. Speeches were given, stories were told, many of which were hilarious and slightly embarrassing. Patricia, Jonathan's long-suffering executive assistant, gave a toast about watching her impossible boss slowly transform into someone capable of considering other people's feelings, delivered with such dry wit that the entire room was crying with laughter. Tyler from Rebecca's old creative department talked about watching her navigate impossible situations with grace and determination, becoming the kind of leader everyone aspired to work for. Michael Chen, the executive from Tokyo who'd been instrumental in one of their early successful partnerships, sent a video message about witnessing their professional synergy and knowing even then that something special was developing between them. The dance floor stayed packed until well past midnight, the celebration extending far beyond the planned schedule because no one wanted the evening to end. Rebecca and Jonathan danced together, sometimes gracefully, sometimes laughing at their own lack of coordination, always perfectly in sync in the ways that actually mattered. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Rebecca and Jonathan found themselves alone in the center of the dance floor, swaying slowly to music that had stopped playing, existing in their own bubble of contentment. "Can you believe we actually pulled this off?" Rebecca asked, her head resting on Jonathan's shoulder. "Building a real, functional, healthy relationship from such a spectacularly dysfunctional beginning?" "Honestly, no," Jonathan admitted. "When you kissed me in that bar, if someone had told me I'd marry you, I would have thought they were insane. When you walked into my office as my new employee and I realized who you were, I was certain it would end in disaster." "It almost did," Rebecca reminded him. "Multiple times. We very nearly destroyed each other." "But we didn't," Jonathan said, pulling back slightly to look at her face, his expression soft with love and awe. "We chose the harder path. We did the work. We were brave enough to be honest, even when honesty was terrifying. And we built something real." "The realest thing in my life," Rebecca agreed. "Who would have thought that a desperate, revenge-fueled kiss would lead to this?" "I would call it fate," Jonathan said, "but you'd probably argue it was just chaos and coincidence that we managed to transform into something meaningful through conscious effort and good communication." "You know me so well," Rebecca said with a laugh. "It was absolutely chaos and coincidence, but we did the transformation part really well." "We did," Jonathan agreed, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "And we're going to keep doing it well. Every day, every challenge, every moment where things get complicated, we're going to choose each other and choose honesty and choose partnership." "Deal," Rebecca said, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted like champagne and wedding cake in the future they were building together, one imperfect, beautiful, hard-won moment at a time. 5 years later, Torres' creative agency had become one of the most respected names in the industry, with offices in 3 cities and a client list that read like a who's who of innovative companies. Rebecca had been named one of the top executives under 40, had published a book about ethical branding that had become required reading in business schools now, and had established a mentorship program for young women entering the creative fields. She was exactly what she'd fought to become, a leader whose success was unquestionable and entirely her own. Jonathan had also evolved, both personally and professionally. Wolf Media Group continued to thrive, but he'd stepped back from day-to-day operations to focus on philanthropic efforts through his foundation. The work he did supporting ALS research and patient care had expanded significantly, becoming one of the most effective private foundations in the neurological disease space. He'd learned to delegate, to trust others, to accept that he didn't need to control everything to create meaningful impact. And on the second Tuesday of every month, Rebecca often joined him at the foundation visits, supporting him through the difficult anniversaries and painful memories. Her presence a reminder that he didn't have to carry his grief alone anymore. They'd built a life together that balanced independence and partnership in ways that worked for them. They maintained separate professional identities, never letting their marriage obscure their individual accomplishments. They still argued, sometimes loudly, about creative direction and strategy, and whose turn it was to unload the dishwasher. They still challenged each other, pushed each other, refused to let each other become complacent or comfortable. But they'd learned to argue without cruelty, to challenge with respect, to push each other toward growth rather than defensiveness. One evening, sitting on the balcony of the brownstone they'd purchased together in Brooklyn, watching the sun set over the city where their chaotic love story had begun, Rebecca turned to Jonathan with a contemplative expression. "Do you ever think about that night at the Mercury Lounge?" she asked. "About how different our lives would be if I'd made a different choice, if I'd just gone home instead of kissing a stranger?" "All the time," Jonathan admitted. "But I always come to the same conclusion. If it hadn't been that night, it would have been some other moment. Maybe we would have met at a conference, or through a mutual colleague, or you would have applied to work at Wolf Media Group through normal channels. Something would have brought us together eventually." "You think so?" Rebecca asked, skeptical. "You think we were inevitable?" "I think people who challenge each other, who see through each other's bullshit, who refuse to accept anything less than authenticity, those people find each other eventually," Jonathan said. "The circumstances might have been different, less dramatic, probably more conventional. But us, we were always going to happen. You were always going to call me on my control issues. I was always going to be fascinated by your inability to be intimidated. We were always going to build something extraordinary together." Rebecca considered that, finding comfort in the idea that their connection transcended the chaotic circumstances of their meeting. "For what it's worth," she said, taking his hand, "I'm glad it happened the way it did. Even with all the complications and pain and difficulty, because it forced us to do the work, to really examine what we wanted and who we were and how to build something real rather than just convenient." "Me too," Jonathan agreed, "though I could have done without the part where you almost left me forever, and I had to watch you walk away knowing I couldn't stop you. That was when I fell in love with you, you know," Rebecca said softly. "When you let me go. When you understood that keeping me meant losing me, and you chose my happiness over your need for control. That was the moment I knew you'd changed, that we might actually have a chance. Worst and best moment of my life," Jonathan said, "letting you walk out of my office with that resignation letter, knowing I might never get you back. But also knowing it was the right thing, the only thing that respected who you are." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands linked, watching the city lights begin to glow as darkness fell. Two people who'd started with a desperate kiss and built an entire life through honesty, courage, and the willingness to choose the difficult path toward real partnership. "Thank you," Rebecca said eventually, "for everything. For letting me challenge you, for investing in my dream, for being brave enough to be vulnerable, for choosing growth over comfort. for being my partner in the truest sense of the word. Thank you, Jonathan replied, for kissing me in that bar, for being brave enough to walk away, for coming back, for building something extraordinary while refusing to compromise yourself, for making me a better man, for choosing me every day even when I'm difficult and controlling and probably impossible to live with. You are definitely impossible to live with, Rebecca confirmed with a laugh. But you're my impossible, and I wouldn't change that for anything. Good, Jonathan said, pulling her close. Because you're stuck with me. Contract signed, vows exchanged, legally binding partnership established. No escape clause. Wouldn't want one if there was, Rebecca murmured against his shoulder, feeling perfectly content in this moment, in this life they'd built through sheer stubborn determination and love. From a desperate kiss to a real marriage, from adversaries to partners, from a story that should have ended in disaster to one that became something beautiful. Rebecca and Jonathan had proven that even the messiest beginnings could lead to extraordinary endings if you were willing to do the work, tell the truth, and choose each other through all the complicated in-between moments. And that, Rebecca thought, as she sat wrapped in her husband's arms watching the stars emerge over Brooklyn, that was the most revolutionary thing they'd ever built together. Not a company or a brand or a strategic partnership, but a relationship that honored both their independence and their connection, that made space for two strong individuals to become stronger together without either one being diminished. It was imperfect and complicated and required constant effort. It was also absolutely worth it. Thank you for staying with Rebecca and Jonathan through their entire journey, from that impulsive kiss in a Manhattan bar to building a life and love that defied all expectations. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for them despite their messy beginning, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories about complicated people finding their way to authentic connection. Leave a comment telling me what you thought about their journey. Did they make the right choices? Could you have walked away like Rebecca did? Would you have taken the risk Jonathan took? I love hearing your thoughts. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.